Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Each month I make a video talking about a few of the books scheduled for publication that month. Today I'm finally listing some books released in August. Before I get started with my list, I want to say, as I always do, that I have put together a quirky and idiosyncratic list of books. And if you're looking for a list of forthcoming popular novels, there are plenty of booktubers you can turn to, or you can find such lists in newspapers and magazines. But my lists are full of titles that, for whatever reason, just sparked my own interests and curiosity. So let's get started. Coming from Farrar, Straus, and Giroux on the 5th of the month comes a collection of nonfiction writing from the wonderful Jamaica Kincaid. This book, called Putting Myself Together, pulls together work from as early as 1974. Many of the pieces were published in the Village Voice, or in the New Yorker, or Ms. Magazine, but most have not been easy to access for quite a while. She is such a bright star, curious and sharp and witty in these essays about everything. I have long loved the cultural criticism in famous essays like Biography of a Dress, which is included in this volume, but so is a really thoughtful piece on the meaning of the garden, an essay I hadn't seen before. Here she takes on both very personal and very political ideas, including the way history feeds the soil where new growth emerges. I'm a huge fan of collections arranged chronologically, primarily because it allows us to see how a writer and her work grow and change over time. If you're a Kincaid fan, loving her novels and stories about life and family in the post-colonial Caribbean, like her book Annie John, for example, or Lucy, this collection might be quite interesting to you. And if you don't know Kincaid's work yet, I might suggest starting with her fiction, but honestly, this collection would be a lovely place to start too. Another book coming out on August 5th is Here Beside the Rising Tide, Jerry Garcia, The Grateful Dead, and An American Awakening by Jim Newton, from Random House, I think. Just a moment of personal backstory here. As I've gone through forthcoming books this year for these monthly videos, I've often mentioned books I knew my brother should read, about the hippie trail, or the Roma, or the one about rugs called Carpet Diem. Another one of my brother's obsessions is The Grateful Dead, and this book just might have to be one of his holiday presents this year. There have been quite a number of books about Jerry Garcia and The Grateful Dead, an immensely popular American band that toured for decades, and a celebration group who still tour, in fact. But from the way this new book is being marketed, it's clear that publishers think this might be a definitive biography of the band, at least for a while. In addition to talking about the life of Garcia and about their time on the road, Newton emphasizes the cultural context plural, that the band navigated over the years. He's writing about the countercultural neighborhood of Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, but also about non-countercultural areas of the country that were also moved and changed by the music and performance of the Grateful Dead. As the pub sheet points out, quote, the Dead played at the Acid Test and the Human Being and Woodstock, at the Occupation of Columbia, and the Bail Ball for People's Park. They performed at the base of the pyramids during a lunar eclipse, at Madison Square Garden to defend the rainforests, in San Francisco to sound the alarm over AIDS, and at Huey Newton's birthday party. For 3 decades, the band explored the meaning and limits of freedom. The radical message of the Dead to reject the mainstream and build a bohemian community radiated across the world, manifesting itself in art, music, business, and politics. Okay, on the 12th of the month comes Between Two Rivers, Ancient Mesopotamia and the Birth of History by Moudhy Al-Rashid, published by W.W. Norton. This sounds like a wonderful book, seriously evidence-based, but also written for a broad audience who hasn't necessarily engaged in scholarly debates about historiography or anything like that before. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, seems to be the place where people began to write things down for the very first time. Some of that writing was utilitarian, counting items in order to keep records, for example. Some were a bit more abstract, an early depiction of a wheel, an approximation of pi, or lines by an astronomer tracing the movements of visible planets. Other tablets share bits of community life, details about a lullaby for a crying baby, ideas about how to rid your house of a ghostly spirit, many, many receipts for beer. And we also see what the pub sheet calls raw and relatable moments, like the messy writing of a preschooler, the mark of a dog's paw walking across fresh clay when the human writer did not intend it, and an imprint of a child's teeth. One of the author's points is that no matter how different their lives might have been from ours, they are our kin. Quote, humanity's earliest efforts at recording and drawing meaning from history reveal how lives millennia ago were not so different from our own. I'm always moved when books help us see that people we think of as very different from ourselves are in fact quite similar. I must admit that I can't quite imagine building an entire book around that idea as a thesis. I'm sure the book must be more sophisticated than that, and it certainly seems to be so well written that even if the idea is hammered out over and over, I might still enjoy the book. I'll share just a couple of comments from early readers. The great Robert Macfarlane calls this a tender, moving, and vivid history of ancient Mesopotamia and how it still speaks to us. And Emily Wilson, who has recently published new translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey, says that Al-Rashid is, quote, a gifted storyteller able to spin a yarn of gold from very fragmentary sources. I'm looking forward to trying this one out. Onward. On the 19th, Farrar, Straus and Giroux will publish Baldwin, a love story by Nicholas Boggs. The author draws on new archival research as well as interviews to write what's basically the first major modern biography of James Baldwin. And he's interested in a question that always fascinates me, too, how personal experiences and relationships shape Baldwin's novels and other writing. I mean, I'm interested in that question about Baldwin, but also about all writers. I think readers learn, often at a young age, that it's pointless and boring to try to explain away every little bit of a novel with its counterpart in the author's life. But that's not what Boggs is interested in here, and not what my interest is either as a reader. Instead, the game is to consider how the experiences of life might inspire certain kinds of larger questions that a writer might explore in the context of a book that shares no direct parallels with real life. The kind of questions or emotions that tie life and literature together might be how one deals with loneliness and rejection, etc. How love shapes us, changes us, how complicated it can be when one wants to form some kind of family, what it means to want to leave a legacy, a literary legacy that will matter for generations to come. Let me read a clip from the publicity materials. The author writes about the ways, quote, Baldwin drew on the complex forces within these relationships, geographical, cultural, political, artistic, and erotic, and alchemized them into novels, essays, and plays that speak truth to power and had an indelible impact on the civil rights movement and on Black and queer literary history. Sounds fantastic, and I'm sure it will get a lot of attention in both readerly circles, but also academic ones. The next book, also to be released on the 19th, is a bit shorter than the biography of James Baldwin. It's The Quiet Ear, an investigation of missing sound by Raymond Antrobus, published by Hogarth. This is a memoir and cultural history of deafness, written by a young British poet. Here's one of his sentences. I live with the aid of deafness. Like poetry, it has given me an art, a history, a culture, and a tradition to live through. This book charts that art in the hopes of offering a map, a mirror, a small part of a larger story. When he was about 6 years old, the author was diagnosed as deaf when his family began to realize that he wasn't responding to sounds like the alarm clock or bird calls or the teapot. Some of his teachers in his primary school thought he was just disruptive, not deaf at all. That, of course, can happen to all deaf young people, but perhaps especially to young boys. It happens even more when you add a class background that doesn't peg you as a student, or when you're biracial, growing up in East London with an English mother and a Jamaican father. Some of you may know that I taught at Gallaudet University, a college for deaf students in the U.S., for several years, and I co-wrote an academic book about a deaf black man in the Jim Crow South who was institutionalized almost his entire life. This author's story is dramatically different, of course, in more than the most obvious ways. One is that American Sign Language, ASL, was developed from French Sign, not British Sign, or BSL. There is a long history there that I can talk about another time if folks are interested. Nevertheless, Antrobus finds what the pub sheet calls inspiring models of deaf creativity later in his life that give him a sense of community, but also possibility and freedom. And those models are from all around the world. I'm looking forward to reading this one, as are many people apparently. I believe Publishers Weekly chose this as one of their top 10 memoirs and biographies for the fall. Okay, the next book is a bit different. It's a new edition of Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, which came into the public domain recently, with the addition of a little commentary about the role of food in the novel, as well as 15 recipes, as the subtitle says, inspired by the Roaring Twenties, published by Chronicle Books. I haven't seen a physical copy of this book yet in person, but my understanding is that there are removable cards with recipes inspired by the novel tucked into the book at the proper spots in the text. My favorite to read about, not to make or eat, deviled eggs 2 ways. Perhaps you remember that Fitzgerald's novel talks about the 2 communities across from each other, East Egg and West Egg. Let me read. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, juts into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. If you're familiar with the novel, I bet you can guess which one includes caviar in the recipe. While I won't be procuring a copy of this book, I can imagine that it might be great fun to look at if you're trying to make cocktails and appetizers for a book club discussion of The Great Gatsby. Coming out from Eliot and Thompson on the 21st of August is In Search of Beethoven, A Personal Journey by John Suchet. I believe this book came out last year in the UK and was quite a success. My favorite review clip is the short one from the Daily Telegraph. Quote, "From palaces to war zones, John Suchet goes on a Beethoven odyssey." Interestingly, this is not the author's first book on Beethoven, but this new one is a bit different from standard approaches. The author's combining bits of biography with memoir and travel log, talking about how Beethoven's music has accompanied him through his whole life, from adventurous teenager to journalist working in war-torn areas, how the music sustained him in different moments. He also talks about his personal travels to this city where Beethoven was born and to Vienna where he died, all in search of more information about the composer and his life. The author's very large point is about what the pub sheet calls the life-changing power of great music. The reviews I glanced at make this sound both very accessible and quite charming. All right, the next book coming out from St. Martin's Press on August 26th is Children of the Book, a memoir of reading together by Ilana Kurshan. I read some of the beginning chapters of this and really enjoyed them, although I can imagine that some readers might not quite know what to make of some of what Kurshan is writing about. By the title, Children of the Book, she's referring to her family's Jewish life. The Jewish community are often referred to as the people of the book. In that phrase, the book refers to the Jewish Bible. Kurshan is talking about her children's reading much more broadly, but quite often she finds some connection between the books she's reading with her children and the particular biblical text they're thinking about each week in school and around the kitchen table. Kurshan, her spouse, and their 5 children who attend Jewish schools in Jerusalem read the same short section of the Torah that all observant Jews read. The 5 books of the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, are read the world over, but also every single year. The sweep of time in an observant household is shaped partly by those stories and words, by reading, that is. But Kurshan is also introducing her children to secular books, from The Very Hungry Caterpillar to Little House on the Prairie books, many of which she herself loved as a child, and some of which are new but have become beloved. Sometimes the weekly biblical readings are connected only in the most metaphoric way. For example, when reading about the first chapters of Genesis, Kurshan talks about how picture books themselves create the world through language for very young children. Similarly, she draws a parallel between the moment her children began reading on their own while she felt stranded on the mountain, just as Moses did, as they entered new lands without her. All this makes it sound like a much more profoundly belief-oriented book than it is. This is about the cultural practice of reading a religious text, not in any way an insistence that the text is absolute truth. So I can imagine that some readers who are not religious and don't usually read religious books might be a bit overwhelmed by how much Judaism infuses the book. And yet I can also imagine parents who are deeply Christian being a bit put off by how literary rather than faithful it might feel to them. And maybe also by the fact that the rabbinic interpretation of the Torah is different from typical Christian reading of the stories, as far as I understand. Meanwhile, as a secular Jew who still connects to a lot of Jewish cultural practices, including regular reading of the Jewish Bible, and as a mother who absolutely adored reading aloud with both my spouse and our child, I must say that I really enjoyed this book. If you give it a try yourself, I would love to know your reactions to it, as well as how you think your own positioning on these issues might shape your response to the book. The penultimate book for today is A Truce That Is Not Peace by Miriam Toews, whose name I should have looked up how to pronounce. It will be released on the 26th by Bloomsbury, USA. One of the blurbs calls this a companion for turbulent times, and that in itself makes this book feel important. I found myself needing to read books that comfort me, and yet I don't feel comforted by books that just want to distract me with overly sweet stories where all the difficult emotions have been excised. This is the kind of book I want. The author is trying to make sense of what writing means to her, writing books, but also writing long correspondences with her family members, and how writing relates to memory. She's trying to write at a time when she's also trying to make sense of what it means to live, especially after her sister's suicide. Things go in all directions. She wants to create a wind museum. She writes about her hilarious memories of traveling with a boyfriend when she was young. She writes about becoming a grandmother. And of course, she writes about her sister, Marge, including her death. There is grief, but there is also guilt, and there is a need to find a way forward. The publisher's sheet includes this wonderful writerly sentence. We, her readers, come to see that the question is as impossible to answer as deciding whether to live life as a comedy or a tragedy. This is very high on my list of books to read next. And finally, the last book I'll mention today will be released on the 28th of August and is called Beginners to the Stage, Please, Secrets of Life Backstage in London's Magical West End by Stewart Arnott. I'm curious if this one will appeal to any of you at all. My son is a theater sound engineer, and when we talk about the plays and musicals he works on, I'm often a bit confused by all the things that need to happen behind the scenes before performances are ready to welcome audiences. I can imagine that this book, since it's about the London theater scene, might have slightly different practices, or even more likely the same practices done by workers with different titles. But I thought it might give me a chance to understand at least a little bit more about the world of theater, how performances are put together and run. Arnott, the author, found himself doing everything from tearing tickets as a teenager to serving as a stage manager for the Phantom of the Opera in the West End at the height of his career. And this wide-ranging view should be fascinating for me. And apparently the book is full of charming anecdotes and also lots of gossip, which those of you who know more about the stars of the West End might appreciate more than I will. Well, that will do it for today's video. I'll be back really soon with a list of books to be released in September. Here's to many great forthcoming reading experiences for all of us. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.